Neighbor cut down several trees on my property, claiming they were a hazard. What do I do? With updates and a conclusion. Is this worth getting a lawyer over? I'm pretty ticked. So I moved into my current house about 2 years ago. It's a beautiful 3-acre property, mostly flat except for about a dozen large trees bordering part of a road that runs alongside my property. I'm not sure what type they are, but they're pretty big. I think they're oaks. Well, I love them. They provide some great shade in the summer during part of the day, and they're just pretty. My neighbor doesn't like them. He's not really my neighbor since his house is quite a bit down the road, but he's the closest one to me. When I first moved in, he came over and introduced himself and asked if I planned to do anything about the trees. I was confused and I told him no. He told me a little bit before I moved in, one of the trees had a branch break off and fall into the road, causing an obstruction that lasted a whole day, according to him. He said the previous owner didn't care and did not cut down the trees, but he, the neighbor, hoped that I would. I told him that I would talk to the previous owner and see about it. I did that, and though it was 2 years ago, as I recall, the owner told me that he went out and moved the branch the moment he saw it. We talked a bit more, and I decided not to cut down the trees. Like I said, I like them. So I was away this past week and weekend visiting family for our annual reunion. I come back and honestly almost drove past my own house because I was so used to seeing the line of trees and they weren't there. He cut down all my trees. I immediately went and asked him, and he said that he had them removed due to being a hazard and that it was legal because the city signed off on it. I was livid, but I just left and told him to stay off of my property. There aren't even stumps, guys. They are completely gone. I asked my other neighbors, one who lives down the road the opposite way and another across the way, what had happened, and they said he had a company out there cutting them all down all week. One of them asked him about it, and apparently he showed them some document from the city that gave him permission to remove the trees. Is that true? Can he just remove my trees? Should I call a lawyer about this? Call the city? I don't even know where to start. It's left that whole area of my property an ugly strip of dirt and loose earth. I know the trees are definitely on my property. The previous owner and real estate agent walked around with me, and I remember them showing me the extent of the property, and it's not like the trees are right up against the road. The trunks were like 15 to 20 feet in from the road, and were probably 15 feet apart. I'm not sure, but they stretched a pretty good amount along the road, and some of the branches definitely hung over the road. What should I do? I also called the previous owner, who was rather surprised to hear from me, and told him what had happened. He was also ticked. He told me those trees had been there since before he bought the house, 20-something years ago, and he also told me what kind. He says they were white oaks, but I'm going to go with what some people suggested and hire an arborist to come out. Now, it should have been more clear that whoever removed the trees didn't take out all the stumps. I meant like the classic 2-foot stump wasn't there, but they were trimmed down to like a few inches. Barely noticeable, and there's a lot of loose dirt like they tried digging or something. I'm going to talk to the police tomorrow and see if I can talk to whoever's in charge of these matters with the city. Hopefully they can tell me if they gave permission to my neighbor or not. An update. This was a busy morning, but I think I'm on the right track. I know my neighbor is a little wealthy since he told me about a summer house that he has, but I don't know if he paid for this or what. So I went to the police first thing and asked to report trespassing and possible vandalism. The officer took down my story, and I even brought him some photos, which he asked to keep. He then told me, and this kinda ticked me off, that unless I had proof of my neighbor cutting these trees down or giving authorization to cut them down, it may turn into my word against my neighbor's. He suggested I just pursue this in court myself. Is he right? I don't want to question a police officer, but I want to be sure. While at the police station, I asked who I would talk to specifically with the city about permits and tree removals, and the officer told me to try the Public Works, which matched what a user commented. So I went home and called them. The lady asked for my street address so she could check it against their records, and I did, and she found nothing. Not a single thing. She said there was nothing regarding my address or property in the last 6 weeks. I noted that and then thanked her. Then I called an arborist like many of you suggested and made an appointment for later this week. She, the arborist, also asked that I have some photos of the trees when she comes, which is fine since I have more. Finally, I looked up companies that do landscaping or logging and tree removal, covering all of my bases since I really don't know who would handle tree removal anywhere other than a forest. Anyways, after calling a few places, I got one who confirmed that they did the job, and they told me that they were following a city order. That call was after I called the lady at the Public Works for the city, and she told me there was no record of my address. Did my neighbor lie to this company? They didn't ask me for more details, and when I asked who showed them the order, they said they couldn't tell me. What? Is this true? I'm going to look up some law offices in my general area and reach out about all of this. Does this fall under a specific type of law office? Like, should I hire a specific lawyer? Sorry, I'm really out of my league here. I'll let you know what happens, though. The company was a tree service, by the way. Didn't even know that was a business type. They aren't exactly local, but they're relatively close by. They didn't tell me what happened to the trees either. This is the beginning from the end of my last update on the original post, which detailed how I went to the police, found the company that did the job, and called the city to find there was no permit issued or documentation related to my address. So I have called a lawyer. After some in-depth searching and a few calls, I've connected with a relatively local lawyer. I'm a bit rural, and we talked for about an hour. He wanted all the details I had, especially when I mentioned the arborist. He asked for the number and told me he was going to ask for additional information from the inspection that would be important for a lawsuit. He also gave me the number of a surveyor and told me that I should call them as soon as possible. He then set me up with an appointment at his offices next week after the arborist visit. As far as the criminal charges, he told me that was my call, but we could talk more about it next week. He did comment that making a police report was a smart move. Lastly, he told me not to contact the neighbor anymore to get a written and signed testimony from the witness neighbor and to report any documents in the mail from either my neighbor or the company that did the job, as well as refusing contact should the neighbor come to my door. I asked if I could continue updating you all, and he said that was fine as long as I don't disclose personal information. So it looks like I'm taking my neighbor's butt to court. I hope somehow I can get my trees back, even just having new ones planted. That area of my property is so barren now. Final update. I can't speak to all the details, and I'm sorry about not continuing to update, and after everything got underway, I figured it would be best not to. To keep it short, we, my lawyer and I, spoke to the police, who then spoke to the neighbors down and across the street, which is the one who witnessed my trees getting cut down, who stated they saw the neighbor and the company cutting down my trees. And then finally, they spoke to him, the neighbor. I don't know much beyond that with the criminal investigation. What happened with the whole city document or the company, and why that is will be explained below. I hauled his butt into court. Well, first the arborist came, as did the surveyor. The trees were on my property, and they were white oaks. The arborist gave me an estimate on having 15 mature white oaks brought and replanted on my property, which was just shy of $650,000. Though he did say that some trees would die and that would drive the cost up. I also had my property appraised for the difference before and after losing my trees. It then became a question of whether I wanted to pursue my lost trees and see how much their lumber was worth, or sue for the replacement cost and loss of property value. Basically, do I want the trees back, or do I want the cost of the ones I lost? Apparently, you can't have both. Well, guys, I picked the trees. The actual court stuff started a lot sooner than I thought. We filed, a few weeks passed, and a few days before our day in court, his lawyer reached out with a settlement offer. Apparently, he was wealthier than I thought. We accepted, and while I can't speak to the details of it, I'm getting the trees back. It's going to take a long time, apparently, several months, possibly all the way until September, since the process didn't start until just this week due to the holidays. But I will have all 12 trees back on my property at no cost to me. My neighbor has also put his house up for sale, and I haven't seen him for quite some time now. Oh well, there's a bit more to the settlement, but I don't feel comfortable speaking to that. Hopefully that's understandable. I remember some of the comments about whether the trees were a hazard to the road based on how far they were from the road, and I ended up having to check with the county, not the city, and they sent someone out to measure and mark the boundaries. My trees were at least 5 feet beyond it, so outside the boundary. Not even close. Would have you done the same thing as OP, standing up for yourself, getting the lawyer involved, and winning this fight? Whatever chainsaw I want, you say? Posted by Nomad65555. This malicious compliance is not my own, but of a friendly, vindictive old man who I'll call Fred that I worked with for around 5 months. As many of you know, I, an 18-year-old male, do tree work for a living, and I have for around 2 years now. My boss, who I'll call Duncan, is a 32-year-old hotshot and the owner of our small company, who can sometimes be a real tool when things aren't going fast enough on a job. Now, Duncan has an old family friend named Fred. Fred worked with Duncan's stepfather at a cement plant for 20 years and is his stepfather's best friend. Fred also retired from said cement plant. Fred is the kind of man who would give you the shirt off his back while being an absolute vindictive smart aleck about you not having a shirt. However, Fred was working for Duncan as a favor since Duncan was understaffed at the time. Because of this, Fred couldn't give a flying flip about his job or what Duncan said or did. Fred took as many breaks as he wanted, when he wanted to, and wouldn't hesitate to tell you where to stick your opinion if you said something about it. Fred's also a complete bull of a man who stands at a hearty 6 foot 3 inches and 275 pounds and easily makes Duncan, 5'10 and 160, look like a shrimp. So usually, Duncan isn't too quick to bother him. So one day we were all doing our thing on the job. We had a big old pin oak to take down, so we were all in our usual positions. Jake up in the bucket truck, James running our loader, and Fred and I chipping brush and shooting the breeze, although I'll admit we were slightly slacking off. Duncan decided he was going to sharpen all the chainsaws that were not currently in use, so he gets to work. Now, for those of you who don't know, sharpening a saw takes a while, and on top of that, all our saws were extremely dull, so they took a lot of sharpening in 95-degree heat, while being stooped down on the door of one of the boxes on our bucket truck. Duncan was sharpening saws for the better part of 2 hours. That's 8 saws. When he finished, we had the vast majority of the tree cut down. All the branches were off, and Fred and I had long since shut down the chipper. And we were taking our lunch since we had nothing to do, as wood is moved from the ground to the dump trailer by James in the loader. For some reason, the fact that we had 20 minutes more work infuriated Duncan. This is especially odd because the tree was coming down very quickly compared to usual, as it was Friday, and we were all hoping to cut off early as we sometimes did. Duncan flew off the handle, screaming at us for the better part of 10 minutes, which ironically extended us to 30 minutes more on the job rather than 20, and he ended his tirade with, "I'm leaving to go do estimates finish and go cut firewood at the yard. You will not be cutting off a second before 3:30. As Duncan stormed away, Fred piped up from the back of the group, just as sweet as pie with anticipation dripping from his voice. "Hey, Lipstick, which one you want us to use?" To which Duncan replied, "I don't give a frick," and stormed away. Me and Fred smiled at each other, thinking the same thing. When we arrived back at the yard, we began getting saws off the truck, from the smallest of trim saws to the largest brand spanking new Steel MS-881 Magnum with a 42-inch bar that we used to cut particularly large stubs. Me and Fred both grabbed a saw and fired him up. We began to cut and cut and cut and cut. For almost 3 hours we cut firewood, making sure to hit the dirt with the saws as much as possible, and going through every saw until they were almost unusable from how dull they were. Trust me, if anyone knows how to dull a saw quick, it's a tree professional. Fred and I were having the time of our lives, dancing and singing and cracking jokes while we cut, while screaming to be heard over the painful wailing of the saws being tortured. When 3:30 rolled around, we threw the saws back in the truck and went home, and I still swear to this day that I heard Fred singing at the top of his lungs as he rolled out of the lane in a cloud of black smoke, which may have been his crankshaft eating some gaskets. Monday, when we get to work, we rolled out to the job site, and Duncan fired up the mammoth steel to crash a huge hickory tree in the middle of the woods. He began to cut, or should I say grind, the tree. The wood was smoking from the terrible amount of friction from a saw that was as dull as it could get. Duncan stopped. He checked the chain. He got another saw and checked the chain. Dull. He went through every saw and checked chains, getting redder and redder. He walked over to me and Fred. "Fred, Blake, why is every saw dull?" To which Fred responded, "Well, Duncan, you told us that you don't give a frick which saw we used, so we used them all. That shouldn't be an issue, right, since you don't give a frick." To which Duncan sighed, knowing exactly what he did, and walked off to sharpen all the saws again. Fred was, is, and always will be my hero and my best friend. He is currently back to living the retired life of working on cars and fishing. Many days I miss him and his offhanded comments, but I'm carrying on his legacy of smart buttery. Just as a disclaimer, Duncan is not a bad boss at all. In fact, he's the best boss I've ever had. He just has this mindset that time is money and that some things should go faster than they possibly ever could. Karen neighbor destroys my property and then calls the cops on me. I'm innocent. Click the video on your screen so you hear how this ends, and I'll see you there.